You're listening to the Paul Young Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of the Paul Young Podcast. You know, we all come from some history, some family history. And I remember when I went in for therapy, one of the first things that I did with my therapist, Scott, was to do genograms. Genograms are where you start to look at both sides of the family tree. I hadn't ever done that before, but it turned out to be a very positive, difficult, painful, beautiful experience. That is looking into my family tree, at least for a generation or two, or three. It was really helpful. It was really helpful to begin to understand where I came from. And it was helpful in terms of my relationship with Scott, because even though I pulled him out of the yellow pages, it turns out that he had already had interactions with my family up in Canada, which was quite miraculous in its own way. So I'm going to answer the question, what were my grandparents like? It spills out from there, but you'll get the idea. And in this way, you'll also get to know me quite a bit more. At some point, God willing, and I'm alive, I'm going to write a memoir. And in that, a memoir is different than an autobiography or whatever the other word is for things that people write about themselves. A memoir is where you look more at points in your life that had very big impact, or just places where you made a change in terms of how you looked at life or how you thought about life. And I kind of like that better. Actually, I like it a lot better than an autobiography that sort of takes your life point for point for point in a chronological sense. And I'm kind of looking forward to doing that down the road. Well, what were my great-grandparents like? I never personally knew my grandparents on my dad's side. Only stories that were told by family or written down by Auntie Gladys. She wrote a book of family history. She was a historian, or is a historian, Gladys, and has written the histories of small communities up and down the west coast of Canada. But she also kept a record of the family tree. And I have that book. It's around here somewhere. And as I type this, Gladys is about to turn 104 years old. That would be on December 29th. She is still sharp. She does repeat herself sometimes. But at 104 years old, the things that are 90 years ago are clearer to her today than some of the most recent things. It takes her a bit to remember who I am. But once we start down the road of remembrances, she gets very sharp and she begins to tell me stories. I hope that I'm going to get a chance to see her before she jumps the twig, as some people say. She's going to be 104. I was planning to meet her, not this last summer, but a summer before, on my way to my 50th high school reunion up in Terrace, British Columbia. But plans changed and we weren't able to make the trip. Someday, I'll tell you a lot more about my great-grandfather, John Fox, on my grandmother's side. He was a rather amazing man. Now, my great-grandfather on my dad's side was born September 12th, 1830, in Frostburg, Maryland, and was named William, called Bill, Henry Young. William Henry Young. My dad is William Henry Young, but he goes by Henry. One note about Bill, he was an abusive father. Back then they called it a strict disciplinarian. Upon his return from a trip, he would question Ophelia, his wife, as to which of the children had been a problem. He would then line up the culprits and take literally a cat of nine tails to them. He died at 65. His gravestone is in Spokane, Washington, not too far from where we live, even though he spent most of his life in Minnesota. My grandfather on my dad's side, Henry Adelbert, called Bert Young, was born March the 11th, 1873, 5 minutes before midnight, along with a twin sister, Helena Adela, who was born 5 minutes after midnight on March the 12th. And he died April 11th at 69 years old. He married Helena Jessie Jones, born in Invention, England, but Helena is not my grandmother. Now, Bert was born in McLeod County, Minnesota, where the family were farmers. He was also very good at hunting, trapping, and fishing. In 1890, his dad died, and Sherm, one of Bert's older brothers, moved into the city, and Bert went too, in his early 20s, and he loved it. He joined the Salvation Army and learned to play the accordion for their meetings. He then began acting in vaudeville shows, and he started gambling as a hobby. On July 9th, 1898, Bert enlisted in the U.S. Army in Little Rock, Arkansas as a private, and for 2 years he was a cook servant in the Spanish-American War. He moved back to Spokane in 1899, and he worked in the orchards, taking him up into the Okanagan Falls, British Columbia area, where he eloped with Jessie Jones and moved to Butte, Montana. We've got a lot of Midwestern and Western folks in my history, although we got a little, England in there too, and the East Coast, Maryland in particular. In 1906, Bert and Jessie adopted Helena Grace Young, one of twins. Same day they went back to adopt the other twin, but she had already been taken. 1908 to 1912, besides orchard work, Bert became a boxer. He was a bantamweight, so he was pretty small. He said he was nicknamed Kid Sleeper and bragged that he never lost a fight. But he was also an invertebrate liar, so who knows for sure. There's a story that some of his kids would sneak downtown where the boxing match were taking place, and he usually ended up on the mat out cold. And so they think that the term sleeper kid came from the fact that he got knocked out so many times. Who knows for sure. In 1917, the U.S. joined the First World War, but Bert, being 44, was too old. He did serve, however, in the Home Guard, in which he became a captain and received a gold medal for marksmanship. Here is where things get really crazy. In 1903, Ollie Fox, my grandmother, was born in Okanagan County, Washington, on her parents' homestead. Her parents had some marital problems, and her dad, John Fox, began taking jobs away from home. In 1910, Olive's mother moved the family to Soap Lake, Washington for a year, during which she and John decided to divorce. John persuaded her and paid for her to return to the homestead, deeded the land to her, and paid child support, and then moved to Alaska to work, eventually into the mines in British Columbia. Now, when Olive was 10 years old, that's 1913, she occasionally sang on the street corners in the Okanagan. And at that time, this is Okanagan, Washington. And at that time, it was acceptable for young women and girls to sing on corners or at gatherings where gold sometimes and silver coins were tossed to them by an appreciative audience. Now, Olive was small for her age, and she's 10 years old, and she had a great personality, and she could sing well. And so this childlikeness and the warm personality easily drew an audience, and her mother welcomed the extra money. Now, one passerby, an itinerant harvest worker, became intrigued with this little girl. To him, she with her dark eyes and blonde curly hair and innocent charm and talent were attractive. He would toss coins, and he would ask for his favorite songs. That was where my grandfather, Bert, met my grandmother, Olive. At 46, Bert befriends Olive's older brother Richard, who was 17, by taking him hunting and fishing. Now remember, Olive is like 10 years old, 11 years old, 12 years old, right in there. So he would take Richard hunting and fishing, and through him, he befriended the family. In 1914, so that was when Olive was 11, Olive's mother got in an online relationship, which is mail order correspondence, with a man in Idaho. And she took the train to go meet him, leaving her daughter with a neighbor. He rapes her. And when Bert told Jessie, his mother, she urged him to take her into their home. Now, a few days later, their adopted daughter came down with a bout of scarlatina, and she had to be quarantined. Jessie elected to stay in the house with Grace, and Bert set up a tent in the yard for he and Olive. And that is when Bert and Olive's quote-unquote relationship began. They got involved. At 11, Olive had been raped by 2 men, and one of them was my grandfather. Now, eventually, Olive's mom came home. Olive went back to school until 1918 when she was 15. It was then Olive overheard a conversation that her mother was having about future plans. She was going to move the family to Great Falls, Montana, with a stop in Spokane, Washington, where she would marry Earl Cook and also marry off Olive to his son Charles Cook, a young man that she had never met. Now, there's much more to the story, but here is the overview. Bert and Richard, remember Richard is Olive's brother, create a plan, and Olive runs away from home with Richard to Squamish, British Columbia. And here, Olive loses her first child to a miscarriage. Meanwhile, Bert, my grandfather, moves his family to Great Falls, Montana, where his marriage becomes strained. He had had multiple affairs, and Bert moved to Squamish, BC, and Jesse to Sacramento, California. And as far as anyone knows, there was never a divorce. There's no record of it or mention of it. Now, John Fox comes to help, disconcerted that his daughter's romantic infatuation with Bert, 30 years her senior, but he found out that he couldn't dissuade his daughter. So he suggests that they get married, not knowing Bert had not even divorced. So on August 18, 1919, the three of them took a train to Vancouver, British Columbia, where they got quickly married. Till the day she died, Olive was sure the marriage was faked. She believed Bert had paid off the minister, who also may have been a fake, to obtain a fake certificate presented that same day. The implications for her were staggering. She was in a sort of faked legal adultery. Something Bert held over her, a lie she couldn't even tell her dad. She didn't know that a legal certificate had been filed with the province of British Columbia, even though Bert never divorced. Bert also lied about growing up in Hamilton, Ontario to try to get citizenship. They were both illegals in Canada. Piece of work, my grandfather. But it says a lot about the things that my own dad struggled with. But for all of his faults, and there were a lot, my grandfather worked hard his whole life, turned out to be a good cook and a creative storyteller. And over the years he softened, his explosive temper tempered, and a bond of some sort of kindness grew between him and Olive. The family grew up mostly in Ballacoola, Haggensburg area of British Columbia. They were poor, but they made it. Grandpa Fox, my great-grandfather, his presence was a big part of their surviving and making it. Olive was almost 5 feet tall and all of 98 pounds, and she bore 10 children, one who died after 16 hours and another as a child. What would have been her 11th child in 16 years was delivered after 5 months in a disintegrated state, and Olive could not return for a time. She was depressed, she had migraines, and in 1940 she gave birth to the 10th of the living children, 14 in total, inside the marriage. April 24th, 1942, 3 p.m. My grandfather Bert died. He was worn out at 69 years. On May 26, 1944, great-grandpa John Christopher Fox died at 82. And listed on his death certificate was exhaustion and senile dementia. He had spent the last years in a care facility for the insane, a reference in those days to dementia. Grandmother Olive spent the last few years of her life in a Catholic care facility and died Monday, May the 20th, 1946, at about 10 a.m., and she was 43, completely worn out. It was a different story on my mom's side. Both of my grandparents immigrated from Europe. Grandpa John Braneski was born in Romania, August 3rd, 1894. His father Carl came from Turkey and was a farmer, and his mother Mary Schlag, who came from Romania, and they together would eventually have 14 children. In 1896, when Grandpa was 3 and a half, his parents and 2 brothers boarded the Bismarck ocean liner from Liverpool, England, and landed in New York City with $40. From there, they traveled to North Dakota, where they stayed with an uncle until they bought a 160-acre homestead for $10. They farmed 160 acres, sowing it by hand, and built a 2-room sod house. They lived there 5 years, sold and bought 40 acres of timberland and coal. Neither the timber or the coal could sustain the family, so they moved to Alberta in 1905. 2 moves later, they were on a homestead in Trochu, Alberta. They tried farming, raising cattle, total fail. They put in a wheat crop, it froze. They couldn't thrash, and in the spring, it all burned down. They tried oats, too expensive to thrash, and by spring, mice had eaten the crop. They lost the homestead and moved to Red Cliff, Alberta, where Carl worked in a coal mine and Grandpa got a job at Alberta Clay Products for 25 cents an hour. In 1913, he got a raise to 27 cents an hour. 1914, World War I broke out, no work. Grandpa walked 100 miles, literally, to get to a rail line. After 2 towns, he got a job as a farm laborer until Christmas, moved around, but no jobs until he heard of a farmer building a barn and a bridge. He discovered he was good at building bridges. He joined a bridge building gang after the first one, oversaw the building of a 150-foot camelback bridge, then painted another bridge, living in tents until Christmas. Grandpa rented a farm and worked in the coal mine during the winters. In 1919, Grandpa married a woman named Lydia Bonet, October 20th, 1919, and they had a daughter, Ellis. They ran a boarding house, and Grandpa worked in a small mine during the winter. When the boss wanted Grandpa to help him cheat the workers out of money, he quit. Their daughter Alice, now 2, died of whooping cough in 1920. In 1922, they moved to Medicine Hat, Alberta, where my mom would be born years later. Grandpa worked on a farm, and when he got back to town, found that Lydia was pregnant and had TB. He started working in a brick and tile factory in town, and in the winter, Ajax coal mine. In 1923, a son, Ernest, was born, but he only lived 9 months, dying of TB meningitis. Lydia got worse and stayed with her parents while Grandpa went to Trail, BC, and found work in a smelter, sending all the money he made home. In October 16, 1924, his wife Lydia died. Grandpa worked in the smelter for another year and then went back to Medicine Hat for a visit. There he met an old friend who sang in the church choir that Grandpa had led. He was 31. John arrived on Thursday, met Emma Opp, 21, on Sunday, and they got married the following Friday, October 21st, 1925. Emma is my grandmother. After their first child, Lloyd, was born, Grandpa quit the smelter because he believed he was leaded, causing sciatica. Eventually, they settled in Medicine Hat, and in 1927, my mom, Bernice, was born, weighing in at 3 pounds, 10 ounces. As the family grew, they became travelers, gypsies living in tents and rented houses, moving constantly to find work. They picked hops. For a time, they had a dairy farm, 3,000 down and a total of 13,000. Milk was 12 cents a quart and cream 25 cents a pint. After many moves in 1948, with 5 children grown, Grandma and Grandpa moved into a house on Rose Avenue in Kelowna, BC. Grandma worked across the street from their house at the Kelowna Hospital, long and hard hours as a cleaning woman. Grandpa worked too, but I don't know what he did. They made one more move in Kelowna in 1977, and then to an apartment in Vernon in 1981. Grandpa died November 13, 1989, and Grandma 10 years later. They were both 94 when they died, but 10 years apart. Grandma's a bit of a mystery. Her parents were John Opp and Magdalena Pietz, German and something else, maybe French and Baltic states. They immigrated to the United States, and Grandma was born in Long Lake, North Dakota, and eventually they moved into Canada and to Medicine Hat. We all lived for a while as children with them in Kelowna. They didn't share much or talk much. Grandpa was a little gruff at times, but never mean, and Grandma was sweet and cooked the best food. I do know they worked hard. In the afternoons, we had to stay very quiet when they watched their show, which was The Edge of Night. Makes me laugh every time I think about it. When they sold their house, they never told anyone that they had a treasure trove of all sorts of valuable things stored in the attic of their garage. It simply went with the new owners. One odd thing that I still don't quite understand. After a cousin Beverly died, I ended up being the oldest child of my generation. Kim and I were living with most of the kids at one of the places in Gresham when he called me on the phone. The only time in my life that my grandfather called me. Sad to say, I had never called him. He was coming down to Portland to see a friend whom he would be staying with, and he wanted to talk to me. I didn't know that he had a friend, and I didn't know who the man was. My grandpa and I spent an afternoon driving around, mostly silent, and finally I pulled over at a city park, and we sat and talked. Well, he talked. He told me some general things about his life, the most I had ever heard from him. Then at one point, tears filled his eyes, and he looked right at me. Paul, for a long time, when your mom was a child, a vicious rumor went around in the city that we were living in that I had had an affair and cheated on your grandmother. After all these years, I haven't said anything. I just needed someone to know that it wasn't true. That was why he had come to see me. Why me? I have no idea. But the older I've gotten, the more precious that conversation is. One day, I'm going to ask him. Thank you for listening. If you would like to contact or connect with us with inquiries and questions, comments, suggestions, stories, and more, please visit paulyoungpodcast.com. There you will find resources and notes related to any particular episode. Today, participate with love, do the next right thing, and trust the ripples.